Okay, welcome to the REBT Advocates. And I'm Dr. Michael Edelstein. And for this episode, I will be joined by a therapist who was on with us before, Ross Grossman. Tommy Bateman isn't here with us today, but Ross will be discussing some questions he has about doing REBT therapy, rational emotive behavior therapy. And just for the new viewers, a very quick introduction to REBT is that our emotions come from our thinking, and our disturbed emotions come from our demands, must, should, supposed to's, our irrational thinking. So that's REBT in a nutshell. And also I want to mention that I'm the author of 3-Minute Therapy, which you could get at the rebt.life. Okay, and so I'm honored to have with us today Ross Grossman, an REBT therapist in the East Bay. What city are you in, Ross?
Actually, in Los Angeles. Angeles.
Ross is in Los Angeles. I didn't know that. Ross, is there anything you'd like to say, an introduction about yourself, or shall we get started with questions?
Oh, just I've been doing this for over 25 years, and I am a strong proponent of rational emotive behavior therapy. It's a big piece of what I do with clients, and I'm very excited to be talking to one of the masters.
Okay, thanks, Ross. And also, speaking of masters, the real master is Albert Ellis. He's written over 80 books on rational emotive behavior therapy. I learned it from him. So I'm really just, everything I say, I got from Albert Ellis. Okay, Ross, do you want to tell us some of the questions you've dealt with recently in your practice?
Well, most recently, I've had a few people, not many, but a few males, strangely enough, who were saying that they felt that the therapy wasn't emotional or cathartic enough for them. And I have to also admit that these folks weren't doing a tremendous job of doing the writing that is a big part of the practice of REBT. They were not doing a thorough or rigorous job of confronting their thought process, but they sort of accused the therapy, and by extension the therapist, of not having a deep and profound and cathartic and emotional impact. And so I, short of blaming the patient, which I don't like to do, I wanted to know your thoughts on how we can best approach situations like that.
Okay, very good. That's a very good question. And interestingly enough, when I started practicing 35 or 40 years ago, I got that question much more frequently when traditional therapy and more psychoanalytically oriented therapy was more the rage. But these days, I hardly get that, but it's a good question and it's an important question. So normally when someone makes a statement that they want a response for, like presumably your client wanted a response to, it's not emotional enough, cathartic enough, the first thing I do is ask them what they mean. What do you mean? Let's start with cathartic. That's a little more obscure term. What do you mean by not cathartic enough? And did you ask him that, or do you imagine?
Yeah, it was about a profound feeling.
Russ, just,
yes.
Do you imagine what he might have said if you didn't ask him?
No, I did. And it was basically the best that one of the individuals could say was that it was not profound. It did not feel emotional. He even said something to the effect of, I could probably talk with my friends the same way we're talking right now.
Okay, so when you say it's not emotional, could you please elaborate? What would it look like to be more emotional?
That's the phrase that you would use with the patient?
Yeah, that's what I'm asking the client. And again, in the service of fully understanding what their issue is, so I can more accurately respond to it.
Well, ultimately, he was pointing at, and I did ask, what is it that you're trying to achieve? He wanted to feel transformed. He wanted to feel better, happier, less stressed out. In one case, it was romantic problems, not achieving as many, not really achieving a satisfying long-term relationship, and having a lot of people leave that person.
Okay, very good, very good. I think we're getting somewhere. So now I'm speaking to the client. So you'd like to feel transformed. I'm glad to hear that, because that's one of the things REBT will help you do. Because what REBT does is it helps you develop a new philosophy, a new perspective on life. You start to look at yourself, others, and your situations in life in an entirely different way. But that's when you learn the principles and you practice them. It doesn't happen overnight, but it
Mm-hmm.
involves practice, reinforcement, repetition to practice the principles. And you will find that you are transformed. You're looking at life a different way. Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, I'm playing the patient right now.
Okay, good.
Yes, that is what I'm looking for. But um, this writing stuff you're having me doing, I'm not feeling it.
Oh, okay. So you're not feeling it, and that's understandable because you're just starting to do it. And there are two levels of feeling it or understanding this different perspective. Level one is where you have a superficial recognition. And I have the impression you do have a superficial recognition of a better way to look at it. And that's probably what you're writing in your 3-minute exercises, the A, B, C, D, E, F. But since you're just starting, you haven't gotten to level two, a deep conviction, of the reality. So you think about it differently, you feel it differently as you'd like to do, you act differently because you've got this deep conviction. And the bridge between level one and level two is the royal road to learning, reinforcement, practice, going over the 3-minute exercises again and again and again. And as long as what you write at E, the effective new philosophy, is
Mm.
meaningful, and you're not just writing what sounds like pie in the sky wishful thinking, but you're really connecting with your E statements, then I'm confident that you will start to feel it and believe it. But again, it takes practice. It's as if you were going to learn another language. Let's suppose you wanted to learn French. You could go over French vocabulary with me in the session and even practice it a little between sessions. But unless you practice it on a regular basis, probably every day for a chunk of time, you
Uh-huh.
won't be able to go to France and speak French with the natives. So it's the same here. It's the same learning principle. So it's practice, repetition, and reinforcement, as long as what you're reinforcing seems real to you, as long as you're connecting with it. So that's what I'd like to see you doing. Uh,
Yeah.
how do you feel about that?
Well, playing a patient here still.
Yeah.
I don't like that, and that seems like it's going to take too long. And I've seen movies, and I've heard of people going to hypnotherapists where people have an epiphany, and it all changes all at once, and everything is, it's blue skies, and they understand now what their life is about, or somehow they got that secret key into the door, and they were able to open up that door to their unconscious, and now they've changed. And you're telling me I got to basically lift mental weights every day to get good at this.
Yeah, yeah, practice. So you're looking for a silver bullet. So I suggest we run an experiment. Uh, you try hypnosis for a couple of sessions and
Uh-huh.
see if you have that transformation. And you're correct, Mr. Client. This is not hypnosis. It's not an overnight cure, just like learning French is not an overnight language learning practice, but rather it takes some work and practice. And by the way, Mr. Client, you probably have noticed that anything you've gotten good at in your life, anything you've mastered, you haven't done that immediately, but you've practiced and you've gone over it again and again and again. If you play a musical instrument, or if you're relatively good at what your work is,
Hmm.
or other things, it took practice. And that's the way we learn meaningful things. Now, if you'd like to try some other therapies that offer a silver bullet, one trial learning, I think that's a great idea. And then if it works, let me know. I'd be happy to find out. And if it doesn't work, I'd be happy to work with you some more. How does that sound?
Well, I'm still have misgivings because I feel like you don't want to hear my emotions. Like you're just telling me to do these things, but I'm hurting.
Yeah.
I want you to hear. I want you to be talking with me about my emotions.
Okay. Well, actually, what I asked about in the first session was your emotions. And then if we want to work on your emotions deeply, and the deep roots of your emotions, which is your philosophy, and not superficially having you discuss your emotions from session to session to session, then it means working on the deep roots. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but I always thought that my emotions were based on things that happened to me growing up. I've had a really rotten, awful growing up and traumas, and people rejected me and treated me poorly, and it doesn't seem like you're not talking with me about any of that.
Yeah. Do you remember our first session when I explained to you how emotions work? And I gave you some examples of how emotions don't come from situations, but rather come from our thinking. For example, if I win the lottery and I'm happy, most people would say I'm happy because I won the lottery, but that's not how we work psychologically. That's the intuitive view, and it's understandable, but it's not how we work psychologically. The way we work psychologically is our thinking intervenes between these situations, winning the lottery, and our emotions. So
Hmm.
the reason I'm happy is because I'm telling myself, isn't it wonderful I won the lottery? This is great. I can now buy a house. That would be lovely. I can travel around the world. That would be marvelous. So it's this kind of evaluative thinking, cognition, that cause our emotion. Now, at that time, you said you agreed with that when I asked you, but it sounds like you're having second thoughts. So what doesn't make sense about how I explained the anatomy of emotions?
Well, obviously, it does make sense. So I can't argue with you at this point.
Okay, so therefore, if we want to change our emotions in a deep way, that we go back to changing our thinking and coming up with reasonable, meaningful ways to look at these situations, and then practicing reinforcement, going over it again and again and again. And I'm sorry if this approach is disappointing, but I can understand that. And the best thing to do is run an experiment. Try some other approaches and see if you change dramatically, passionately, fundamentally in a few sessions. How does that
Okay.
sound?
Okay. It sounds sort of okay, but I think I've got some sort of trauma, and I think that trauma is what's making this happen. And I think that that's more like beyond thinking, isn't it? Isn't that just more like a physical reaction that I'm getting?
We'll get to trauma in a minute, but let me ask you, Ross, as the therapist, not as
Okay.
the role-playing client.
Switching hats now.
Yeah, do you have any questions about my suggestions so far to you as a therapist in terms of how you can address this issue with the client?
No, no, these are solid interventions. I'm going to be repeating these. I'm going to be reviewing this video.
Okay, and is the client still with you?
Um, So far, yes.
Okay, so it is also important to get feedback. So after each point, uh, say something like, "Do you see what I'm saying? Does this make sense? What's your interpretation of what I'm saying?" Because people easily say, "Yes, yes, I see what you're saying," but that doesn't tell you much.
Yeah.
So unless they repeat back to you in some way what they think you're saying, and then you correct them when they're off, then they may not understand what's going on.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so try that with the client. And we have a few more minutes. Was there another part to this that you wanted to bring up?
Um, there, there's the idea that the client has, and several clients have, that because they have failed and because they may not have what society ranks as high visual or some other criteria that a lot of people choose for dating and mating, they may believe, and based on consistently not having relationships work out over time, the client believes that they may not be, in fact, lovable over the long
Right.
term.
Right.
And at times, I feel I'm at a crossroads. I could go one way, which is let's look at the scientific lack of validity of that claim. Yes, you may have so far not encountered someone who would be willing to love you long term. That's one way that's a little more okay. You have not dated all the women in all the countries in all the world, so we can't make an accurate assessment here. Or the other way, which I often like to go with, which is the worst case scenario, kind of immunity about the issue of just not being loved and how horrible, unacceptable that is. So what is your take on that? Whether you
Yeah.
go with the practical, scientific proof or no proof, or the let's go with worst case scenario and immunize you against that.
Okay, very good. Good question that I get from therapists. And just let me say, as an aside to you viewers, that although this is supervision for a therapist, if you're not a therapist, or even if you are, the goal of REBT is to teach you to be your own therapist. So if you're not a therapist, now you are. You're your own therapist. So these principles that I'm going over with Ross are principles you can use yourself in helping yourself identify and overcome irrational, dysfunctional thinking. Okay, so that's the aside, and now we'll get back to the question. So this is a great question because it illustrates another principle of REBT. So someone brings up a problem and there are various elements to it, and you don't know which direction to go in. Then the thing is to ask the client, but before asking the client, some education is in order, and that is teaching them the problem separation technique, which I discuss in a few chapters in my book, 3-Minute Therapy. So let me lay that out for you. The problem separation technique says, as we go through life, we have various goals, various objectives we wish to achieve. So for example, long term, I'd like to be healthy and get along with people. Short term, I'd like to get up early tomorrow morning to get to work on time. So those are some goals and preferences. Now we would use, and those I would call practical problems. How can I be healthy? How can I live a long life? And then I can study diet, research, speak to others, trial and error, exercise, those kinds of things. So those are practical approaches. And then in terms of getting to work on time, that's another practical problem. How do I make sure I get up on time? Do I use an alarm clock, or do I use a wake-up service, or do I just get to bed extra early to make sure I don't oversleep? So those are some practical solutions. So this we can call practical problems, which we address with practical solutions. But then, being imperfect humans, we often escalate these practical problems into emotional problems by getting anxious, depressed, angry, about the situation. I'm anxious about oversleeping. I'm depressed about facing this crummy job again, etc. So those are emotional problems. So then I would, after explaining that, I'd ask the client, any questions about the difference between practical and emotional problems? So Ross, did you have any questions, either in your role as a therapist or in your role as the client?
Well, in my role as the client, I'm mostly concerned about how am I going to find love when everyone who I've been with, most everyone, has left me after a very short time.
Okay. So again, that's a practical problem. And if you like, we can discuss practical solutions. But then if you have an emotional problem about this, this could interfere with implementing practical solutions. Because if you're anxious, for example, it could make it, you could bungle it in trying to use some of these practical solutions. Or if you're depressed, that might come across to the person you're dating, and that wouldn't help either. Or you might withdraw. So those are all possible emotional problems. So I would ask the client,
Yes.
does any of these emotional problems ring a bell? And if they, just to short circuit this, if they say, yes, I'm depressed, then I'll say, okay, very good. So you have a practical problem and an emotional problem. Which would you like to start with? Rather than deciding myself. And then usually they either say, well, usually they do say the emotional problem, but so I say, very good. And then
Right.
I teach them some REBT about emotions. And if they say practical problem, then I suggest, well, first I would ask them, what have they tried? And then I'd suggest practical solutions. And if they say, well, I don't know, then I would suggest starting with the emotional problem, because as I mentioned, as long as you're depressed or anxious or angry, it's going to interfere with implementing these practical solutions. And also learning how to overcome emotional problems, learning some of the steps and concepts will help you in the future in becoming your own therapist.
Well, as a therapist here, I am drawn towards the more, what I find is the most elegant solution. After, of course, we've said, hey, what are you doing about your dating life? And what are you doing towards romance? And how are you behaving? Just those basic real life issues. But
Yeah, those are good. I'm sorry I interrupted. Go on.
I like to lean into, let's go with what you feel is the most horrifying, terrible, unacceptable outcome for for this situation or for your life. And let's de-horrify that first, because I feel that is the deeper level of our ABT, where we go with, let's look at the idea that you may never be loved again in the way that you wish you would be loved.
Okay, again, I would, if you delve into the emotional problem and they're not on board with that, I think you have a larger chance of losing them. So again, I would go with asking them, laying out both practical and emotional, and asking them which they would like to start with. Now, assuming they say they'd like to start with the emotional problem, then REBT education is the next step, and explaining, as I illustrated a few minutes ago, where emotions come from and how we create emotions and how we overcome our emotional problems, how we change our thinking to do that. So that would be the first step, education, not jumping right in and asking what's the worst case scenario or things like that. Does that
Okay.
make sense?
I hear you. I hear you. And so when you have a client, though, who comes in and says, no, nothing works, I've done everything you've asked that you're talking about in terms
Okay.
of the practical problem.
Oh, yeah.
And then in terms of the emotional problem is, I believe I'm never going to achieve love ever again. And it's destroying me because
Okay.
I need love.
Okay. So I would say, okay, so are you saying, Mr. Client, you'd like to work on the emotional problem now, or you'd like some more suggestions on the practical? Because You could tell me what you've been doing practically, and I could give you
Okay.
feedback on how to make that more effective.
Well, I'm not here for the emotional problem. I'm here
Yeah.
to find a way to find love again. And I need to be loved, and I'm not being loved.
Okay, so you said a few minutes ago you understand the difference between the emotional and practical, or I thought you said that, maybe not. Uh,
I did, but I'm contradicting myself because I actually am here to simply get the solution to how I can find love long term.
I see. Now, you sound like maybe the identical twin of the other client who wanted a magic bullet. And as I said in the first session when I outlined REBT, there are no magic bullets. It takes work. And if you think of anything you've gained worthwhile in your life, I would say 99% of those things you've gained that's worthwhile through practice and repetition and reinforcement. And as I said to your identical twin brother, that if you want to try something else that will give you a silver bullet, a magical solution, that's fine. In fact, I'd be interested to find out what comes up. But I don't have that. So if you're here for that, I'm sorry, you're in the wrong place, but I think I can offer you something even better. Not only a deep solution to this, but also a new perspective and a way to be your own therapist in the future.
So, even in this situation where the person is saying, look, I understand what we're here to do is deal with emotions, but all I want to do is find love because that's the most important thing. And I'm drinking and I'm carousing and I'm visiting places I shouldn't visit because I need love. You would not necessarily then go, okay, let's go to the fact that you're holding on to this idea of needing love, the dire need for love, as Ellis put it. Would you not visit that concept with them?
Well, I'd visit with them if that's what they want me to
Okay.
do. But remember, I'm an employee here. They're my boss. They're paying me. So I'm going to do what they want for a few reasons. That's one reason. But also a very important reason is if I'm doing something and they don't see the relevance of it, the need for approval, and do you really need approval and things like that. If they don't see the relevance of it, I don't think there's much hope in helping them that much. So I go with clients small step by step to make sure they're on the same page. And so far, you as client and I are not on the same page. And another way we're not on the same page, Mr. Klein, is you said, I thought I was here to deal with emotions. Well, this client has a listening problem. I never said that we're here to deal with emotions. I said, I'm here to help you. When you first came in, I said, I'm here to help you. How can I be of help? So if you heard me say that I'm here to deal with emotions, that was probably one of those other therapists you went to look for that silver bullet, but it wasn't me, I'm afraid.
Okay. Okay. So well, I'm going to repeat back to you as if I'm a patient, just it's dawning on me now. So what you're saying, Mr. Therapist, is that if I want to get to the root of my emotions, I need to look at my thoughts, and only then, if I do it rigorously and over time and with practice, will I have this cathartic or powerful or transformative experience about my emotions.
Yes, I'm glad you said that for a few reasons. One, as the therapist, Ross, that reminds me of one thing that I suggested to you that I didn't do, and that is saying, do you see what I'm saying? What am I saying? It would have been better if I said that earlier, and then you would have given me this response. And then the other thing is you're implying, Mr. Client, that this is going to happen overnight. If you practice and practice, then all of a sudden you're going to have this epiphany. And normally that's not how it works. Normally, if you start working on this the way I suggested at the end of the last session, you'll slowly begin to think differently. New ideas that you haven't adopted yet will come into your head in these situations. You still will not have implemented them, but those ideas will be there. And then the more you practice, and by the way, it's important to say that practice includes not only questioning your thinking and contradicting your thinking over and over again, but rather it also includes behavior, taking risks, risking rejection if you have a fear of rejection,
Mm.
or doing difficult things if you're compulsively procrastinating on those. Then that's the key. Russ, we don't have any more time right now, but I think
Okay.
this was very good. And thank you for bringing up these issues, because I think they're key in supervising therapists. Many therapists have brought that up, and in working with clients, many clients have brought up those same things. So they're not unusual issues from clients or problems therapists have. So I think this was very instructive. And I'd like to thank you for participating. And Ross, was there any final thing you wanted to say about what we discussed, or telling the viewers about yourself?
Only that as I say, I'm in Los Angeles, and I work extensively with folks who are open to cognitive behavioral therapy. I am also working with a lot of folks on the anxiety that has been that is coexisting, shall we say, with the current pandemic crisis that we're dealing with right now, which
Okay.
hopefully will be over soon.
Very good, very good. And also, in terms of my practice, I wanted to mention that I do a lot of phone, Skype, and Zoom therapy, remote therapy, and that seems to work pretty well. Well, thank you for watching. And if you'd like to volunteer to be on the Therapy Advocates with a problem or a question or supervision that you'd like, just let me know. And my email is below, Dr. Edelstein at 3minutetherapy.com. It's also on my website, 3minutetherapy.com. So please do that. Ask questions, comment below, and give us a like, donate to Patreon if you liked it. And don't forget to stay on the rational side of life.